His daughter's smile, a story of regret and redemption. Dominic told her the baby wasn't his, and then he walked away. But 2 years later, his daughter's smile shattered his world. Elena had never felt so small in her life as she did that afternoon, standing in Dominic's office. The city lights stretched out behind him like a crown of power, his tall figure silhouetted by the glass wall of the Zurich skyscraper. He looked in every way the formidable CEO, his dark hair neatly combed, his suit impeccable, his penetrating blue eyes reflecting both intelligence and coldness. She had rehearsed her words over and over in her head, on the way there, clutching the strap of her worn purse as if it could hold her together. Yet when the moment came, her voice trembled. She told him she was pregnant, that she was carrying his child. For a beat, she waited to see some flicker of warmth in his eyes, some sign of the man she once thought she knew. Instead, his lips curled into a sneer that sent a cold heat through her chest. "It's not mine," he said flatly, the words severing the fragile hope she carried. His voice held the same finality he used in boardrooms when closing deals, and there was no room for negotiation. Elena's heart fractured as she looked at him, unable to comprehend how easily he could dismiss her. Dismiss them. She wanted to reach out, to make him understand that this was not a mistake, not a trick. But the way he crossed his arms, the way he avoided her eyes, told her the wall was already up, higher than she could ever climb. She tried to speak again, but her throat constricted, and her words came out broken and weak. He didn't listen. Instead, he walked toward the door, opened it, and gestured for her to leave, as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. Elena walked out slowly. Her heart was beating so hard, she thought she might collapse. The sound of the door closing behind her echoed like a verdict. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to cry in front of his staff, who passed by with curious eyes. She kept her head high as she left the building, even though she was breaking into pieces inside. The cool night air hit her arms as she stepped onto the street, and it felt cruel that the world could continue as if nothing had happened, while her life had just been destroyed. Every dream she had built in her heart came crashing down with his cold look, and those 3 words. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself and pressed a hand to her stomach. She was terrified and alone, but she wasn't completely alone. There was a life inside her, and she realized that no matter how cruelly Dominic had rejected them, she could not, she would not, give up on her child. That little spark growing inside her gave her a reason to keep going, even if it meant walking away from the man she once thought would be her eternity. That night, as she sat in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling with tears sliding down her cheeks, Elena made herself a promise. She would find the strength to raise this child. She would work harder than ever. She would sacrifice everything if necessary. Dominic may have cast them out, but she would not let that define their lives. She whispered to her unborn baby in the quiet darkness, promising to be mother and father, protector and provider, however impossible it seemed. And even though fear clawed at her, a quiet determination began to take root inside her chest. The silent struggle, the weeks following that night unfolded in a blur of agony and fear, but Elena forced herself to keep moving because there was no one else to lean on and no safety net to fall back into. Her tiny apartment felt colder and lonelier than ever. Yet, she tried to turn it into a place of solace, lighting candles at night and covering the peeling wallpaper with photographs and reminders that she wasn't as broken as she felt. Morning sickness sometimes left her curled up on the bathroom floor, but once the illness passed, she dragged herself up, washed her face, and went to work. She clung to the steady rhythm of her job as a waitress. The clatter of dishes and the murmur of customers gave her a distraction from the thoughts that tormented her every night. Her coworkers whispered about her growing belly, some kind and understanding, others cruel in their speculation. But she learned to ignore them, focusing only on the tips she needed to earn and the meals she needed to pay for. Despite the struggle, Elena found moments of unexpected strength. She learned to budget carefully, cutting out everything non-essential, and spent her evenings researching clinics and prenatal care options she could afford. Sometimes she walked through the park on the way home, placing her hand on her stomach, as if the baby inside could hear her promises, whispered into the night air. She talked to her child about the stars, about the dreams she once had, and about the future they would build together. The more she spoke aloud to the little life growing inside her, the more she began to believe she could keep those promises. It wasn't easy. Her body ached, her savings dwindled, and loneliness threatened to consume her. But she pressed on, reminding herself daily that her child deserved love and stability, no matter how hard the road was. As her belly grew, so did her determination. In the second trimester, her baby's movements filled her with a strange mix of fear and wonder. Each flutter reminded her that she was no longer just surviving for herself, but for someone who depended completely on her. She looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back, her eyes more tired, but her resolve sharper. Nights of crying into her pillow slowly turned into nights of quiet planning, mapping out what the next year would look like, how she would pay for childcare, and what part-time classes she could take to land a better job in the future. She had no family to guide her, no partner to share the burden, but she carried herself with a silent pride that even surprised her. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in, moments when she replayed Dominic's sneer in her mind and felt the sting of rejection anew. She wondered if he ever thought of her, if he ever wondered about the child he had so cruelly discarded. In her darkest days, she imagined running into him on the street. She imagined him looking at her rounded belly with regret. She imagined him realizing the truth he had refused to accept. But these thoughts were dangerous, for they stirred emotions she couldn't afford to feel. She learned to lock them away and remind herself that she and her child were enough, even without him. When her due date finally approached, Elena felt equal parts terror and anticipation. She spent her nights folding tiny clothes she had bought secondhand, looking at the crib she had assembled in the corner of her bedroom, and praying for the strength to do everything her child needed. She had no illusions about how hard it would be, but the thought of holding her baby in her arms gave her a hope she hadn't felt in a long time. And as she lay awake listening to the city hum outside her window, she whispered into the silence one last time, promising her child that no matter how much the world had taken from her, she would never let it take the love in her heart. A blue-eyed truth. The day Sophie was born did not begin with a sense of magic, but with a fear that clawed at Elena's chest like a vice. She had been alone in her apartment when the first wave of sharp pain tore through her body, doubling her over and causing a glass of water to fall to the floor. For a moment she froze, clutching her stomach, realizing with cold clarity that the time had come. Panic gripped her as she looked around the small space. No one to call, no family to lean on, no man nervously waiting to rush her to the hospital. She grabbed the small bag she had packed weeks before with trembling hands, slipped on her worn shoes, and called a taxi with tears blurring her eyes. The driver asked no questions. Perhaps he saw the fear on her face. Perhaps he had seen this kind of desperation before. At the hospital, the harsh fluorescent lights and sterile smell made her feel like a stranger in her own skin. Nurses moved around her with practiced efficiency, their voices firm but kind, guiding her to breathe through the contractions, to focus on her body's rhythm. But the reality of being alone pressed harder than the weight of the pain. She looked at the door more than once, half expecting to see Dominic burst in. his blue eyes wide with guilt and panic. But he never came. Each contraction reminded her of his absence. Each cry carried the echo of his rejection. Yet, somewhere deep down, a stronger voice began to answer, whispering that she didn't need him, that she could bring this child into the world on her own. The hours stretched into what felt like an eternity. Sweat clung to her skin, and exhaustion clouded her thoughts. But she clung to the lifeline of the nurse, who gripped her hand and told her she was stronger than she believed. Elena endured with every flicker of willpower she had left, her body shaking as if it would break, until finally, in the early hours of the morning, a cry filled the room. The sound was raw, sharp, and beautiful, cutting through the haze of pain and exhaustion. They placed the tiny face against her chest, and Elena felt her heart stop, and then start again, beating harder than ever. She looked at the small face marked with wisps of dark hair, the penetrating blue eyes that shone up at her with innocence and trust, and her tears flowed freely. The nurse asked if she had chosen a name, and Elena whispered, "Sophie." Her voice cracked, as if the name had been waiting inside her all along. She pressed her lips to the baby's forehead and felt something shift inside her. All the rejection, all the pain of the last 9 months seemed to disappear in the warmth of her daughter's tiny body. She had been abandoned, yes, but now she had been given something infinitely more valuable than the man who had discarded her. She had a purpose, a reason to fight, a love so fierce it scared her with its intensity. As the hours passed and the hospital room grew quiet, Elena studied her daughter's features, tracing the shape of her small nose, the curve of her lips, and the unmistakable reflection of Dominic's eyes. The resemblance was undeniable, and while it broke her heart, it also filled her with a strange sense of triumph. He had denied her. He had denied them. But here was the proof of the truth, alive and breathing in her arms. She promised Sophie that night, under the soft glow of the hospital lamp, that she would never let her feel unwanted, that she would never repeat the cruelty they had endured. Her voice was hoarse, her body exhausted, but her soul was steadier than ever. 2 years of quiet love. The first year with Sophie was a blur of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and quiet moments that stitched themselves into Elena's memory like fragile threads of hope. The apartment, though small and worn, became a sanctuary, filled with the sound of tiny cries, soft lullabies, and the creak of the second-hand rocking chair she had bought. Elena quickly learned that being a mother was both the hardest and most rewarding thing she had ever done. There were nights when Sophie's cries seemed endless, when Elena sat on the edge of her bed, rocking her until her arms ached, whispering soothing words through her own tears of exhaustion. Yet, in the early morning hours, when Sophie's small hand curled tightly around her finger, Elena felt a surge of strength that reminded her why she had to keep going. Money was scarce, scarcer than Elena thought possible. She returned to work as a waitress only a few weeks after giving birth, leaving Sophie in the care of a kind elderly neighbor who charged little but treated the baby as her own grandchild. Every euro Elena earned went toward rent, formula, and the second-hand clothes Sophie quickly outgrew. There were days when Elena skipped meals so her daughter would never go hungry, but she hid the sacrifices behind a smile every time she looked into Sophie's large blue eyes. The more she looked into those eyes, the harder it became to ignore the truth of her origin. They were Dominic's eyes, clear as day, a reflection of the man who had turned his back on them. Strangers sometimes commented on Sophie's striking features, how unusual it was for such a small child to have such penetrating blue eyes. And Elena would smile politely, while a silent storm raged inside her. By the time Sophie was a toddler, Her personality began to shine through. She was curious about everything, pointing at book and demanding to know what the pictures meant, tugging at Elena's hand to lead her to the playgrounds, laughing with a joy so pure it softened even Elena's darkest moments. Elena would sit on the park bench watching her daughter play, sometimes overhearing parents whisper among themselves about how much the little girl looked like someone they couldn't quite place. Elena dreaded the day when someone would connect the resemblance to Dominic. She feared the whispers that might become truths she wasn't ready to face. She still avoided places where she might run into him, keeping her world small and safe, even if it meant missing opportunities that might have eased their struggles. There were nights when she lay awake listening to Sophie's gentle breathing, wondering how different life would have been if Dominic had believed her, if he had stayed. She thought of the way his mouth had sneered at her, the finality in his tone, and that fueled her anger. Yet no matter how much she told herself she hated him, a part of her wished he could see what he had left. That desire made her feel weak, and so she buried it under layers of determination. She promised herself over and over that she didn't need him, that Sophie didn't need him, that they were stronger without him. Yet the resemblance between father and daughter grew stronger with each passing day, and Elena knew deep down that one day Dominic would see it too. As Sophie became more verbal, she began asking innocent questions about fathers, questions prompted by what she saw in books or noticed in families around them. Elena answered carefully, gently explaining that some families looked different, that some children only had one mother, and that they were still a family full of love. Sophie seemed to accept the explanation, but Elena couldn't shake the fear of the day she would want more answers, when she would demand to know who her father was and why he wasn't there. The thought haunted Elena as she worked double shifts, as she tucked her daughter into bed, as she drove past expensive restaurants where she sometimes imagined Dominic having lunch, unaware of the life growing just a few blocks away. One rainy afternoon, as Elena carried groceries back to the apartment with Sophie firmly grasping her hand, she caught her reflection in a shop window. She froze for a moment, struck by the undeniable truth staring back at her. The small girl, with dark hair and bright blue eyes at her side, looked so much like Dominic that Elena's heart flipped over. It was no longer just her imagination. It was undeniable. She leaned down and kissed the top of Sophie's head, whispering that she was perfect, that she was loved, and that nothing in the world could ever change that. Inside, however, Elena felt the ground shift. She could ignore the resemblance, she could deny the whispers, but she knew the day would come when their two worlds would collide again, and nothing would ever be the same. The collision. It happened on a night Elena would never forget, though she had planned nothing out of the ordinary. Her friend had convinced her to attend a charity event at one of Zurich's most luxurious hotels, insisting that she needed a night off from work and responsibilities, that even a struggling mother deserved to feel like herself again. Elena was reluctant, but she agreed, after making arrangements for Sophie to stay with her trusted neighbor for the night. She borrowed a simple but elegant dress from her friend, carefully styled her dark hair, and for the first time in years, allowed herself to feel beautiful. She had no idea that the night would mark the moment her past and her present would collide in a way she could never have imagined. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, and the drone of wealthy guests exchanging empty compliments filled the air. Elena felt out of place. Her heart beat fast as she held a glass of water and walked near the edges of the crowd. She told herself she would stay an hour, and then she would leave, returning to her quiet life unnoticed. But as she turned to head for the refreshment table, her gaze met a familiar figure across the room. Dominic. He was surrounded by a small group of men in sharp suits, his presence as imposing as ever, his dark hair impeccable, his penetrating blue eyes scanning the room with authority. He looked almost exactly as he had years ago, perhaps a little older, perhaps more polished. But the effect he had on her was instantaneous and devastating. Elena froze in her tracks. Her stomach twisted painfully. She wanted to run, to disappear into the crowd, but she couldn't take her eyes off him. The memories surged, his sneer, his denial, the crushing moment he told her the baby wasn't his. She had spent years trying to erase that night, building a life without him. But here he was, larger than life, and her heart betrayed her by accelerating faster. For a few seconds, she thought he hadn't noticed her, but then his gaze shifted and landed directly on her. The faint smile on his lips wavered, and a flicker of something, confusion, recognition, perhaps even shock, crossed his face. Elena's instinct was to flee, but her feet felt rooted to the marble floor. Dominic excused himself from his group and walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps. Every click of his polished shoes on the floor resonated in her chest like a drumbeat. When he finally reached her, his expression was unreadable, yet his eyes scanned her face, as if trying to reconcile the woman in front of him with the girl he had discarded. Elena managed to whisper a polite greeting, her voice tight, her throat dry. Dominic returned the greeting, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. There was a hesitation there, unusual for a man who always seemed so sure of himself. They spoke briefly, their words stiff and formal at first. He asked how she had been, and she forced a smile, replying that life had been busy, but fulfilling. She didn't mention Sophie, although the thought of her daughter burned in the back of her throat with every passing second. Dominic seemed to sense there was something unspoken. His gaze lingered on her longer than it should, and Elena noticed the way his brow furrowed slightly, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't realized existed. The tension was unbearable, and Elena excused herself, claiming she needed some air. She walked out onto the balcony, gripping the railing and breathing deeply, trying to steady herself. But fate wasn't finished with her that night. A photograph on her phone lit up the screen when she checked her messages. A picture of Sophie her neighbor had sent earlier, smiling with wind-blown hair and clutching a toy in her small hand. A gasp caught in Elena's throat as she looked at it, her heart filled with love and fear. She didn't hear Dominic step onto the balcony until he was just a few feet away. He glanced at her phone, and for just a second, his eyes caught the image of the little girl. His jaw clenched, his expression shifted, and Elena quickly pulled the screen away. He asked who the child was, his voice low, controlled, but tinged with something raw underneath. Elena hesitated. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her silence was stronger than any answer she could have given. In that moment, she saw a flash of understanding in his eyes, fleeting, but powerful. He didn't press her further. Not that night. But the way he looked at her as she walked away from him to leave told her that questions had been planted. Questions that wouldn't go unanswered for long. She left that hotel with her heart pounding and her mind racing, knowing that the careful life she had built, the delicate walls she had erected to protect her daughter and herself, were about to break. The inevitable reckoning. Dominic couldn't sleep the night after the charity event. His mind returned again and again to the image he had glimpsed on Elena's phone. It wasn't just that the girl was beautiful, or that Elena's reaction to his question had been evasive, but the features he thought he recognized on that small face. He tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, to convince himself that his imagination was playing tricks on him. But no matter how many times he reasoned with himself, the image of those bright blue eyes and the familiar lines in the girl's expression tormented him. He poured himself a drink. He sat in his immaculate penthouse with the city stretching out below him, and realized for the first time in years that he felt out of control. He had built an empire on decisiveness, clarity, and precision, but now his thoughts were a storm of doubt and suspicion. The next day he found himself distracted in meetings, his usual sharpness dulled by gnawing questions. His assistants noticed, his board members noticed, but he dismissed them with curt comments, refusing to let them glimpse the turmoil inside him. When the day finally ended, instead of going home, he instructed his driver to take him to the neighborhood where he thought Elena lived. He wasn't even sure if she was still there, but something compelled him to search. He sat in the car for nearly an hour, scanning the streets, until he finally saw her. She was carrying shopping bags, her hair pulled back, looking tired, but still with the quiet dignity he remembered. And walking beside her was the little girl. Dominic's breath caught. The girl was no more than 2 years old, her small hand wrapped tightly around Elena's. She had dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and eyes so unmistakably blue that he felt as if he were looking into a mirror of his own. The resemblance wasn't imagined. It was obvious, undeniable. He froze as his driver asked if he should proceed. But Dominic waved him down, unable to stop staring. The girl giggled at something Elena said, and even her smile carried a reflection of his own. It was like being hit by a wave. The truth crashed over him with full force. He was a father, and he had abandoned them. He didn't approach them that day. He couldn't. Shame and fear rooted him to his seat, leaving him to watch as Elena guided the girl into the apartment building, and they disappeared from view. That night, he awoke it again, the ceiling above him blurred as guilt and regret consumed him. He thought of the words he had spoken years ago, the sneer on his lips as he denied her, the cruel dismissal that had driven her away. He had thought himself untouchable, immune to mistakes, and now that arrogance had cost him something he hadn't even allowed himself to imagine he wanted. The following days turned into a silent battle within him. He wanted to confront Elena, to demand answers. But what right did he have after what he had done? He wanted to see the girl again, hear her voice, know her name. But he knew it wasn't that simple. Instead, he began to find excuses to drive past her building, to linger in places where he thought he might catch a glimpse of them. Each time he saw the little girl, the resemblance only grew stronger, and each time Elena saw him, her expression hardened into a look that warned him not to come closer. She knew he was watching, and even without saying a word, her cautious glances told him she wouldn't let him back into their life easily. At night, he began writing letters he never sent, confessions on expensive stationery that he tore up in frustration. He tried to explain himself, to put into words the fear he felt, the immaturity that prompted him to walk away. But the words always sounded hollow compared to the reality of what she had endured alone. For the first time, Dominic faced the possibility that all his wealth, his power, his influence meant nothing compared to the one thing he truly wanted, a chance to know his daughter, and he had no idea how to earn it. Meanwhile, Elena felt the pressure of his presence. She noticed him in the distance, sometimes in his sleek car, sometimes across the street, and it rekindled all the anger and pain she had buried. She had fought too hard to build a life for herself and Sophie, to forge a sense of peace from the wreckage of his betrayal, and the thought of letting him in terrified her. Yet, she also couldn't ignore the truth. Sophie was his child, no matter how hard she tried to shield her from it. She lay awake at night debating what was right, torn between protecting her daughter from the man who had hurt her so deeply and acknowledging that perhaps Sophie deserved to know her father. The tension grew heavier with each passing day. The unspoken truth hung between them like a storm about to break. Elena knew he wouldn't stay in the shadows forever, just as Dominic knew he couldn't live another day without confronting what he had lost. The inevitable reckoning was approaching, and when it came, it would either destroy them completely or open the door to something neither of them had dared to imagine: the path to atonement. Dominic could no longer maintain his distance. Weeks of watching from afar had undermined his resolve until the desire to know his daughter outweighed the fear of rejection. One afternoon, as the city sank into its twilight glow and the streets outside Elena's building quieted, he told his driver to stop. His palms were sweating in a way they hadn't since his early days of negotiating deals. But this was no boardroom battle, and no amount of money or strategy could guarantee the outcome. He got out of the car. His heart pounded with every step toward the entrance, rehearsing words that sounded inadequate, even in his own mind. When Elena appeared, holding Sophie's small hand as they returned from an outing, he froze at the sight of them together. Sophie was wearing a little blue dress that highlighted her eyes, and when she laughed at something her mother said, the sound pierced him directly. For a fleeting moment, he considered turning back and running, but then Sophie looked up and saw him. Her blue eyes fixed on his, and something shifted in the air. She didn't know who he was, not really, but children had a way of sensing what adults tried to ignore. Her head tilted with curiosity, and her lips curled into a faint smile before she hid shyly behind her mother's leg. That simple gesture sent a wave of emotion over Dominic so strong that he nearly stumbled. Elena noticed his presence then, her whole body tensing, her hand gripping Sophie's protectively. The look she gave him was sharp, full of alert and anger, but also shadowed by something he couldn't name. He raised his hand slightly, as if to show he intended no harm, and forced himself to speak. His voice came out rougher than he intended, trembling with the weight of all the words he hadn't spoken for years. "Elena, please," he began. His eyes briefly flicked to the little girl watching him from behind her mother's leg. "I know I don't deserve this, but I need to talk to you. Just a moment. Please." Elena hesitated, torn between slamming the door in his face and allowing him to speak. Years of pain and betrayal flared in her chest, reminding her of the night he dismissed her, the arrogance in his tone as he denied responsibility. She wanted to tell him to go back to his world of wealth and power, to leave them in peace. But when she looked at Sophie, she knew the decision was no longer just hers. Finally, she nodded curtly, indicating a bench outside the building. They sat down, Elena keeping Sophie close on her lap, while Dominic struggled to find the words. The silence stretched unbearably until he spoke again. "I was wrong," he said simply, each syllable like gravel in his throat. "All those years ago, I was terrified. I thought I would lose everything if I admitted what was real. I told myself it wasn't true, because it was easier than facing what it would mean. But then I saw her, and I knew instantly. She's mine, isn't she?" His voice cracked as he looked at Sophie again. "She's our daughter." Elena's eyes welled up with tears that she tried to blink away. She wanted to stay strong, to shield herself from the man who had once destroyed her. But the sincerity in his voice was unlike anything she had ever heard from him before. She felt her defenses falter, even as her voice remained sharp. "Yes, she's yours," she whispered. "But where were you when I needed you most? Where were you when she was sick and I stayed up all night praying she would be okay? Where were you when I couldn't pay the bills and thought I would lose everything?" Her words hit him like punches, each one dragging him deeper into the pit of his guilt. He bowed his head, shame burning through him, and for the first time in his life, Dominic, powerful, unstoppable, revered, looked completely broken. "I was a coward," he admitted. "I thought being a father meant giving up everything I had worked for. But the truth is, without her, without you, everything feels empty. I don't expect forgiveness, Elena, but I can't keep pretending I don't care. I love her, even though I've missed those years. and I love you, even though I lost the right to say that a long time ago." The words hung between them, fragile and raw. Elena remained quiet, her heart at war with her head. She wanted to push back, to remind him that love wasn't enough after years of abandonment. But when Sophie stirred in her lap and reached out to Dominic with innocent curiosity, it was as if fate had answered for her. The little girl extended a hand, her tiny fingers grasping his, and a sob caught in Dominic's throat as tears welled in his eyes. That simple touch was more powerful than any argument, more undeniable than any denial he had once made. Elena's voice softened, though it trembled. "This isn't about me. If you want to be in her life, you'll have to prove it. Not with money, not with promises, but with actions. And if you fail, Dominic, I will never forgive you." He nodded vigorously, his chest tight with a mix of hope and terror. "I won't fail," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I swear it." That night, as Elena took Sophie inside, Dominic sat alone on the bench, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just happened. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the depth of his regret and the possibility of redemption. It wouldn't be easy, and he knew Elena would test him at every turn. But as he thought of his daughter's tiny hand in his, he realized he would do anything to prove he was worthy of her. Redemption and a new beginning. Dominic's world shifted completely after that first fragile connection with Sophie. From that night on, he set out to prove that his promises were not empty words, but the beginning of something lasting. It wasn't a simple path, because Elena, hardened by years of struggle and disappointment, refused to let him into their lives without demonstrating consistency. She allowed him small, carefully supervised visits, and each one was like a test of whether he truly understood what it meant to be a father. Dominic accepted every condition without complaint. He arrived early, never late. He didn't bring large gifts to impress, only small tokens, like children's books or crayons, that delighted Sophie. For a man who once measured value in stocks and contracts, it was humbling to realize how a child's laughter over a coloring book could feel like the biggest victory of his life. At first, Sophie was shy with him. She watched him curiously from across the room, clutching tightly to Elena's arm, as if measuring whether she could trust this new presence. Dominic didn't pressure her. He simply stayed close. He spoke softly and showed her with actions that she was safe. Weeks passed before she climbed onto his lap, of her own accord, clutching her favorite stuffed animal. But when she did, Dominic felt his chest ache with an emotion he had almost forgotten existed. He read to her that day, stumbling a little over the voices he tried to invent for the characters. But her giggles of delight told him he was finally breaking through. Elena, standing at the doorway, watched the scene with mixed emotions. She wanted to keep her walls up, but the sound of her daughter's laughter with her father stirred something deep inside her that she couldn't silence. The transformation in Dominic extended far beyond the small apartment where Elena and Sophie lived. For years, he had run his company with ruthless precision, but now he found himself delegating more, choosing to attend Sophie's preschool recital instead of another board meeting. At first, his colleagues were surprised, unable to reconcile the man who once lived only for his empire with this version, who canceled a client dinner because he promised a bedtime story. However, Dominic didn't care about their whispers, because for the first time in his life, he felt like he was living for something real. The empire he once thought he would lose by choosing family suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the warmth of a child cuddling in his arms at night. There were setbacks, moments when Elena's distrust resurfaced, sharp words that reminded him that a few good weeks didn't erase years of absence. She watched him closely, as if expecting him to fail, and Dominic accepted it without anger, because he knew she had every right to doubt. Instead of arguing, he redoubled his efforts, showing up consistently, respecting her boundaries, and letting time prove his intentions. Little by little, Elena's icy exterior began to crack. She found herself noticing the way Dominic looked at Sophie, not just with guilt, but with genuine adoration and wonder. She remembered the man who used to be arrogant and cold, and marveled at the change. She couldn't deny that he was different now, and even though forgiveness wasn't yet complete, the possibility began to take root. The turning point came on a stormy night, when Sophie fell ill with a high fever. Panic gripped Elena as she rushed through the apartment, trying to soothe her daughter, and without hesitation, she called Dominic. Within minutes, he was there, huddled by the bed, his suit soaked by the rain, his face pale with worry. He stayed all night, holding a cold cloth to Sophie's forehead, whispering words of comfort, refusing to leave, even when Elena urged him to rest. When morning came and Sophie's fever broke, Dominic wept silently, overwhelmed with relief. Elena watched him then, truly watched him, and realized that he was no longer the man who had abandoned them years ago. Something inside her softened irrevocably at the sight. In the months that followed, their dynamic began to change. Elena allowed him to take Sophie on weekend outings, and those short visits grew longer. The three of them began to share small family moments, picnics in the park, dinners at cozy restaurants, even quiet nights at home watching movies. It was awkward at first, a patchwork family learning to find its rhythm, but over time, those moments knit together into something whole. Dominic found himself laughing more than he had in years. The weight of his old loneliness lifted as he embraced this new life. For Elena, it was a slow healing, a cautious trust rebuilding piece by piece. But she couldn't deny the joy of watching Sophie grow up with the father she had always deserved. 2 years after that first fragile meeting, Dominic planned something he never thought he would have the courage to do again. At the same restaurant where fate had placed his daughter in his life, he arranged a quiet dinner. Elena arrived with Sophie, unaware of his intentions, and as the evening unfolded, Dominic rose from his seat. His hands trembled, but his voice was steady. He looked at Elena, his eyes full of humility and love, and spoke words that carried the weight of his transformation. "I once told you I would lose everything if I chose you. I was wrong. With you and Sophie, I gained everything I didn't know I was missing. I don't just want to be a part of her life anymore. I want to be a part of yours, if you'll let me. Will you give us another chance together as a family?" Elena gasped. Her heart pounded as the memories of their past wrestled with the undeniable truth of the present. She looked at the man in front of her, not the cold millionaire who had once rejected her, but a father who had fought to reclaim his place, and a partner who had finally learned the value of love. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at Sophie, who was smiling at her parents with innocent hope, and in that moment, Elena knew her answer. She nodded. A smile broke through her tears, and Dominic's heart soared with a joy he once thought lost forever. Their story did not erase the past, but transformed it. From pain came growth, from abandonment came redemption, and from regret came a love stronger than either of them had ever known. Dominic once feared that family would cost him everything, but now, as he embraced Elena and Sophie in the restaurant where his life had changed, he realized he had found the only treasure that mattered: redemption and an open ending. 2 years after that first fragile meeting, Dominic was ready to take the biggest leap of his life. At the same cozy restaurant where fate had brought him face to face with his daughter, he arranged a quiet dinner. Elena arrived with Sophie, unaware of his full intentions, and as the evening unfolded, Dominic rose from his seat. His hands trembled, but his voice was firm. He looked at Elena, his eyes full of humility and love, and spoke the words that carried the weight of his transformation. "I once told you I would lose everything if I chose you. I was wrong. With you and Sophie, I gained everything I didn't know I was missing. I don't just want to be a part of her life anymore. I want to be a part of yours, if you'll let me. Will you give us another chance together as a family?" Elena gasped. Her heart pounded as the memories of their past wrestled with the undeniable truth of the present. She looked at the man in front of her, not the cold millionaire who had once rejected her, but a father who had fought, truly fought, to reclaim his place, and a partner who had finally learned the value of love over assets. Tears filled her eyes as she looked at Sophie, who was smiling at them with innocent hope. Elena knew her answer was not simple, and it could not be a swift yes. "Dominic," she whispered, the name both a plea and a warning. "I see your change. I see the man Sophie has brought out in you. And yes, you have earned a place in her life. But you hurt me deeply. Trust isn't something that comes back just because you asked for it in a beautiful restaurant." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "The journey isn't over. We are not a fairy tale. If we take another step, it has to be slow, honest, and with the full knowledge that the future is completely uncertain." A flicker of fear, but also profound respect, crossed Dominic's face. He knew she was right. He had to keep earning his way forward, day by day. "I accept that," he said, clutching her hand. "I don't need a guarantee, Elena. I just need a chance to prove that I will never let you down again. We will take it at your pace. Every day, a new choice to build this family." Elena nodded, a weary but hopeful smile touching her lips. "Then let's start by walking out of here as the parents of a beautiful girl who deserves all our best together. The rest we will figure out later." They stood up, the three of them, leaving the restaurant. Dominic didn't get the easy yes he might have once expected, but he received something far more valuable, a fragile, hard-won opportunity. Their story was no longer about a final destination, but about the long, uncertain road ahead, where the battle for trust and forgiveness was just beginning, and the only certainty was the shared love for their blue-eyed daughter.